Welcome to this deep dive. Pull up a chair, get comfortable, and, really settle in.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
Because today we are taking you on an intellectual journey that is, quite frankly, going to completely dismantle how you view the world.
Oh, without a doubt. It really will.
And when I say you, I mean you, our listener. You are the third mind in this room with us today. It is Monday, March 2nd, 2026. And as we were going through our notes for this, we both realized that the ideas we're about to explore, they feel more shockingly, almost terrifyingly relevant right now than they did when they were first written over a century ago.
They absolutely do. It's the kind of material that forces you to look at your own foundational beliefs and ask some very uncomfortable questions.
Yeah, uncomfortable is the right word.
And as we settle into this space, you might notice the visual backdrop I've set up for us today. I wanted something that captures the erratic, soaring nature of our subject.
I was looking at that before we started recording. It's intense.
Right. So right now, you're seeing a rugged, violently steep 19th century Swiss alpine landscape. But keep an eye on it. As our conversation shifts, that landscape is going to morph into a cluttered, dimly lit writing desk piled high with chaotic notes.
Love that.
And occasionally you'll see it fade into the crumbling, sun-bleached marble of ancient Greek ruins. It's kind of the perfect restless atmosphere for the terrain we are about to cover.
The shifting backdrop is incredible. It completely captures the frantic energy of the man we are discussing today.
Exactly.
So let's lay out the mission. We are diving into a wealth of material primarily drawn from excerpts of the Cambridge Companion to Nietzsche, edited by Bernd Magnus and Kathleen M. Higgins.
A fantastic collection, really.
It really is. And our goal here is ambitious, but I think it's entirely necessary. We are going to rescue Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes. We have to.
We need to rescue him from the bumper sticker quotes, the, edgy dorm room posters, and the shallow pop culture misunderstandings that have just totally plagued his legacy.
It's so true. He's become a caricature.
Right. We are going to separate the actual flesh and blood man from the towering mythical legend he became. And we're going to unpack the most profound, challenging, and surprisingly therapeutic insights he left behind.
It's a crucial mission, primarily because of how thoroughly his thought has saturated our world, often without us even realizing it.
We're swimming in it.
We really are.
Huh.
The philosopher Richard Rorty made this brilliant observation that our entire contemporary era can essentially be characterized as post-Nietzschean.
Yeah.
We are all living in the blast radius of his ideas.
But there's a huge irony there, right?
Oh, the ultimate irony. Almost every major political and social movement has tried to claim him as their own personal mascot.
Yeah.
Throughout the 20th century and well into the 21st, you have progressives, emancipatory feminists, socialists, anarchists, and American neoconservatives, all proudly declaring Nietzsche as their intellectual ally.
It's all over the map.
It is. And most tragically and destructively, his work was notoriously misappropriated and mutilated by fascists and the Nazis.
And that is exactly why, before we go a single step further, we need to make a very clear, completely impartial disclaimer to you, the listener.
Absolutely necessary.
We are not taking sides today. We are absolutely not endorsing any of the political viewpoints, whether left-wing, right-wing, or anything in between, that have attempted to appropriate Nietzsche over the decades.
Right.
Furthermore, we are not here to endorse Nietzsche's views ourselves. Our sole purpose in this deep dive is to impartially report on, analyze, and synthesize the fascinating, incredibly complex ideas contained in the text we've been provided. We are your guides through the philosophical architecture, nothing more.
Precisely. We're here to examine the historical context, the psychological vivisections, and the actual words he wrote. We're leaving the political adoptions and personal endorsements at the door.
Yeah, because you have to.
You do. Because to truly understand this material, you have to approach it with a completely clean slate.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you look around, Nietzsche really is everywhere in our culture.
He really is.
The text highlights this beautifully, and it's almost comical how widely his quotes are sprinkled across entirely different mediums. Like, think about the movie Coming to America.
Oh, classic.
You have Eddie Murphy quoting Nietzsche at length during a climactic romantic moment.
Right, which is just bizarre when you think about it.
Totally bizarre. And in the 1980s, there was literally an electronic dance pop band that named itself The Will to Power.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. And if you want to go back to vintage quintessential American television, even the teenage doctor on Doogie Howser, MD, drops the ultimate cliche into his digital diary.
Let me guess. Whatever doesn't destroy me makes me stronger.
You got it. And today, his epigrams are used to sell everything from elite gym memberships to corporate self-help books.
It is the ultimate paradox of his legacy. You have a man who wrote with such blinding, labyrinthine complexity, a man who actively despised mass culture and herd mentalities,
Hated them.
and he's been systematically reduced to motivational sound bites for the very masses he critiqued.
How does that even happen?
Well, to understand how that monumental distortion happened, we can't start with the philosophy. We actually have to start by looking at the physical, mundane reality of his life,
Right?
which stands in stark, almost pathetic contrast to the legend that grew around him. If you look at the backdrop right now, let's focus on Sils Maria.
Right, that little Swiss alpine village. Because when people picture Nietzsche writing, they usually picture some grand, tempestuous philosopher standing on a mountain peak, shouting at the heavens, wrapped in a fur coat.
Exactly, the Stormbringer.
But the reality described in the material is so remarkably humble. The room he rented in Sils Maria during his summers wasn't some grand philosopher's sanctuary. It was a simple, unheated, wooden-walled room in a local village house. It had a narrow bed, a basic wash table, a small, uncomfortable sofa, and a writing desk with a lamp. That was his entire universe.
Just a cramped little box.
Yeah. And if we look at 1888, which was the final year of his sane life, he wasn't sitting there as a world-renowned intellectual titan. He was virtually unknown to the wider world.
Completely obscure.
He was sitting in that little cramped room, writing furious, petty letters, complaining about a local Swiss writer named Karl Spitteler, who had insulted him in a newspaper.
What's fascinating here is the massive, almost unbridgeable gulf between that mundane, highly irritable, very human reality and the sweeping legend that was constructed immediately after his mental collapse.
People just totally made up a character.
And essentially invented a fictional character. The text points to people like Clarence Darrow, the famous American lawyer, and Giovanni Papini.
What did Papini say?
Papini wrote this glowing, almost religious tribute in 1922. He described Nietzsche as a pure, saintly martyr figure. He claimed Nietzsche was slain by a vulgar world, dying of, quote, unappeased love.
Unappeased love. What?
Yeah. They painted this romantic portrait of a solitary, tragic saint of the intellect, a man whose mind was simply too pure and too profound, and it shattered under the agonizing weight of his own brilliant thoughts and the world's cruel ignorance.
I always struggle with that mad genius trope. It sounds poetic, but it completely erases the physical reality of the human body.
It's a total erasure.
He didn't go mad from thinking too hard or from a broken heart because the world didn't read his books. The medical reality, the actual tragic truth of his collapse, was biological.
Very much so.
He suffered from paralysis progressiva. That is the clinical term for the late tertiary stages of syphilis.
Yes. And the material includes a highly revealing, almost heartbreaking anecdote from Paul Deussen.
He was a friend of his, right?
Yeah, a fellow student and a lifelong friend. Deussen recalled a conversation where Nietzsche described a trip he took to Cologne in 1865 when he was just a young, incredibly sheltered student.
Okay.
He asked a cab driver to take him to a restaurant, but the driver, completely unprompted, took him to a brothel instead.
And Nietzsche's reaction is so telling. He didn't embrace the debauchery at all.
Not even slightly.
He said he was suddenly surrounded by apparitions in tinsel and gauze. He was absolutely terrified. He stood there speechless, completely paralyzed by the awkwardness and the sheer physical reality of the situation.
He was completely out of his depth.
And his instinct, his deeply ingrained, polite, middle-class reflex, was to make a beeline for a piano that happened to be in the room. He struck a few chords just to break the suffocating spell, and then he immediately fled.
Right. It's a highly documented medical history, not a mystical transcendence into madness.
Right.
He most likely contracted the disease around that time in his youth, perhaps from a subsequent, less documented encounter. And the bacteria slowly, relentlessly ate away at his nervous system and his brain over the next 2 decades.
That sounds horrific.
It caused him agonizing physical pain, near blindness, and eventually culminated in his complete irreversible neurological collapse in 1889.
But the public didn't want to hear that.
Exactly. Here is the critical point. The public didn't want the medical reality. Syphilis is ugly, it's common, and it carries a moral stigma. They wanted the legend of the martyred genius.
Give them a hero, right?
Yes. And to understand why the cultural appetite for that specific legend was so ravenous, we have to look backward at the political situation in Germany during the 1850s.
I'm glad you brought this up because I had no idea how much of this lone wolf philosopher image was actually a byproduct of mid-19th century German politics.
It's wild when you look at the history.
Take us back to that era because this totally reframes how we view intellectuals today.
Okay, so we have to look at the aftermath of the failed German Revolution of 1848.
Okay.
Following that uprising, the government instituted a period of severe political and social reaction known as the Nachmärs, or aftermarch repression.
A total crackdown.
A brutal crackdown. The state and the church were terrified of another uprising, so they reinvigorated their authority and cracked down hard on any dissenting thought.
Makes sense from their perspective.
Their logic was simple. Revolutionary acts are spawned by revolutionary ideas, and revolutionary ideas are spawned by philosophers.
Ah, so blame the academics.
Exactly. Therefore, they systematically purged the university philosophy departments of anyone or anything remotely subversive, politically active, or genuinely challenging.
Which essentially meant they purged anything actually worth reading.
Pretty much.
If you remove all the challenging ideas from an academic department, you are just left with bureaucrats grading papers. Academic philosophy became incredibly boring, sterile, and entirely disconnected from the real, bleeding problems of human existence.
It became a joke to the general public.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to read a government-sanctioned treatise on abstract logic when their actual lives were undergoing massive industrial and social upheaval.
Right.
The universities lost their monopoly on profound thought. And this massive cultural vacuum created a brand new, incredibly lucrative market for freelance philosophers, thinkers, who existed completely outside the official university system.
Like who?
Well, Arthur Schopenhauer was the first massive beneficiary of this cultural shift. He was the ultimate outsider. He wrote with brilliant, engaging literary style, and he tackled the big, dark, pessimistic questions of life and suffering that the university professors were strictly banned from touching.
Okay, I know Schopenhauer.
And Schopenhauer had a very dedicated disciple named Julius Frauenstadt.
Traunstedt. If there is a villain in the story of how philosophy became a cult of personality, it might be him.
He is arguably the architect of the modern myth. Frauenstadt essentially invented the knight-errant archetype of the philosopher.
He was like a 19th century PR guy.
He was. He acted as Schopenhauer's publicist, and he deliberately portrayed Schopenhauer not as the cranky, incredibly difficult, often highly unpleasant man that he actually was in real life.
Right.
Instead, Frauenstadt painted him as a solitary, persecuted genius. He created this heroic narrative of a lone knight battling the dragons of academic stupidity, systemic falsehood, and societal decay.
It's brilliant marketing.
Through Frauenstadt's marketing, the personality, the suffering, and the rebellious stance of the philosopher became almost more important than the actual philosophical texts themselves.
And Nietzsche directly inherited this exact prepackaged legend. It really makes you pause and look at our modern culture today.
Oh, totally.
Think about how obsessed we are with the misunderstood, suffering artistic genius. Whether it's a tortured musician, a rogue tech founder, or a renegade filmmaker, we absolutely love the idea of the lone wolf speaking truth to power from the wilderness.
It's an archetype we can't let go of.
But how much of that archetype isn't some eternal human truth, but just a lingering hangover from a highly specific 19th century German political marketing campaign?
It's a great question.
Because when you look at Nietzsche's actual background, he wasn't born a wild feral mountain hermit. He was deeply embedded in the most traditional establishment German culture imaginable.
Precisely. He was the son of a respectable Lutheran pastor. He was steeped in the Pfarrhaus tradition, the Protestant parsonage tradition that formed the absolute bedrock of Germany's intellectual and moral elite at the time.
Right? He was raised in the church.
He grew up surrounded by pious women, playing the piano, reading scripture. He was a brilliant, highly polite, immaculately dressed classicist.
Not exactly a rebel yet.
Not at all. He was so well regarded by the establishment that he was appointed as a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel at the outrageously young age of 24.
Before he even finished his doctorate.
Yes. He wasn't an outcast hammering at the gates. He was an insider who was handed the keys to the kingdom, and then he ultimately decided to walk away because his mind and his body demanded something else.
But the tragedy of his legacy doesn't stop with the knight-errant myth. The ultimate hijacking, the truly dark turn in how the world received Nietzsche, was orchestrated by his own family.
This is where the story gets really dark.
Specifically, his sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. After Nietzsche's mental collapse in 1889, when he was rendered essentially vegetative and incapable of defending his own work, Elizabeth swooped in and took total ownership of him and his estate.
Yes.
And we need to be clear about who she was. She had married a virulent, prominent anti-Semite and proto-Nazi named Bernhard Förster.
A terrible guy.
They were so committed to their terrible ideology that they actually traveled to the jungles of Paraguay to found a pure, Aryan, anti-Semitic utopian colony called Nueva Germania.
It was a disastrous failure, of course.
Obviously.
When the colony collapsed and her husband committed suicide, Elizabeth returned to Germany, heavily in debt. She looked at her suddenly famous, entirely incapacitated brother and realized she had a gold mine.
She just saw dollar signs in political power.
Exactly. She gained absolute legal control over all his unpublished notes, fragments, and drafts, what scholars call the Nachlass. And she didn't just publish them, she ruthlessly and selectively edited them.
She literally cut them up. Right.
She literally used scissors and glue to splice disparate fragments together, completely removing their original context. She suppressed anything that contradicted her political views, and she published this Frankenstein's monster of a manuscript as a supposedly finished book called The Will to Power.
It's intellectual forgery on a world historical scale.
It really is.
She intentionally twisted his highly nuanced psychological thoughts to align perfectly with a militaristic, fascistic, German nationalist agenda. She curated an archive that eventually welcomed Adolf Hitler himself.
It's sickening.
And the sickening irony is that when Nietzsche was sane, he fundamentally despised German nationalism. He openly mocked anti-Semites, and he famously wrote that he would gladly have all anti-Semites shot.
He abhorred them.
His sister turned his legacy into the exact thing he hated most.
It took decades of painstaking academic work in the mid to late 20th century, led by scholars like Walter Kaufmann and Mazzino Montanari, to go back to the original unedited manuscripts and finally strip away Elizabeth's fascist distortions. But the damage was profound.
So we have a medically tragic, physically agonizing life that was airbrushed into a saintly myth by the public, and a deeply nuanced, fiercely independent philosophy that was mutilated into fascist propaganda by his own sister.
A double distortion.
Yeah. If the biography and the legacy have been this distorted, it begs the question, what about his actual ideas? What was he really trying to say beneath all this baggage?
Let's get into it.
Let's dive into the core philosophical enigmas that defined his work. Because as we read through the Cambridge Companion, it becomes incredibly clear that reading Nietzsche is like looking at a coin with two very distinct, almost contradictory faces.
That's a perfect way to conceptualize it. The material emphasizes that virtually all serious scholars recognize these two faces, though they debate endlessly on how they interact.
Okay, what's the first face?
First, there is the negative, deconstructive face. This is the Nietzsche who operates like a demolition expert. He is actively vivisecting our common cultural heritage, tearing down Western metaphysics, questioning the very foundations of scientific objectivity, and mercilessly exposing the psychological rot at the root of Christian morality.
That's the face most people recognize, the iconoclast with the hammer.
Right, he's the guy pointing out that the emperor has no clothes, and the emperor's palace is built on quicksand.
It's incredibly satisfying to read because his critiques are so sharp. But you can't just destroy everything and leave a void. Which brings us to the second face.
Exactly. The second face is the reconstructive positive face. This is the Nietzsche who seems to be offering profound visions of the future, new modes of existence, and alternative ways of valuing life.
And this is where the academics start fighting?
Oh, it's an academic bloodbath. Scholars completely disagree on what this positive face is actually trying to achieve. Some readers look at him and say, okay, he destroyed the old system and now he is acting as a traditional philosopher trying to build a new one.
They want to systematize him.
Yeah, they think he is giving us a new theory of knowledge, a new moral philosophy, and a new ontology, a new theory of what reality actually is. They focus heavily on his three massive trademark concepts: perspectivism, the will to power, and the eternal recurrence.
But if you read him as a traditional philosopher trying to build a new solid system, you run into massive logical roadblocks almost immediately. Let's look at perspectivism as the prime example.
Okay, let's do that.
Perspectivism essentially argues that there is no objective God's eye view of reality. There is no ultimate capital T truth waiting to be discovered. There are only various interpretations of the world generated from specific, localized perspectives.
Right, that's the basic summary.
But hold on, I'm struggling with this. If he is making the claim that everything is just an interpretation, isn't he trapped in his own paradox?
Oh, sick.
The statement, everything is an interpretation, must also just be an interpretation. So why should I believe him? If he admits he's just giving me his personal, subjective perspective, why should I accept it as a foundational truth? It's the classic liar's paradox. It completely devours itself.
That is exactly the trap. If he's making an objective, universally true claim, that objective, universal claims don't exist, he's contradicting himself in the very act of speaking. It makes him look like a sloppy thinker.
Right.
But the material offers a brilliant, highly compelling alternative way to read his reconstructive face. What if we stop trying to force him into the mold of a traditional epistemologist?
Okay.
What if Nietzsche isn't trying to give us a new theory of knowledge at all? What if he's acting as a philosophical therapist?
A therapist. Okay, explain that, because that completely changes how you read the text.
Think about what a therapist does. A therapist doesn't usually give you a new, perfectly logical mathematical equation to solve your life. A therapist tries to cure you of your neuroses, your harmful habits, and your destructive patterns of thought.
They try to change your perspective.
Exactly. On this therapeutic reading, Nietzsche is looking at Western humanity and diagnosing us with a severe 2,000-year-old addiction to Platonic and Christian thinking.
An addiction to what, specifically?
We are addicted to the idea that there is a real world, a heaven or a realm of pure objective logic that is somehow better, truer, and more stable than the messy, chaotic, physical world we actually live in.
So when he says truth is an illusion, he's not trying to establish a new academic theory of truth that we need to memorize and defend.
No, not at all.
He's using a rhetorical shock tactic. He's trying to break our deep-seated habit of constantly looking for an unmediated perfect fit between our human words and the vast universe. He's trying to cure us of the anxiety that comes from realizing we can't achieve a God's eye view.
Exactly. He wants us to stop longing for an impossible objectivity and start taking responsibility for the perspectives we do create. And he does this by deliberately using language that breaks the rules of language.
Break the rules of language.
Yeah, the material introduces this fascinating idea of self-consuming concepts. Nietzsche will deliberately use a phrase that requires the very contrast it is actively trying to destroy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's unpack the linguistic concept they use to describe this. Catachresis.
Yes, catachresis.
I had to reread this section a few times. The classic example of catachresis is the phrase table leg. Think about that for a second. It is simultaneously literal. That piece of wood holding up the dining table is literally in the dictionary called a table leg. There's no other word for it.
Right.
But it's also a metaphor, because a table is an inanimate object. It doesn't have biological legs with muscles and bones. It's a paradox built into our everyday language.
And Nietzsche's concept of the will to power operates exactly like this catachresis. We are neurologically and grammatically wired to think of the world as being made up of solid things or subjects that perform actions.
Right.
We think there's a doer behind every deed.
Yeah, subject and verb.
But Nietzsche wants to cure us of this grammatical illusion. He asks us to imagine a world composed entirely of events, forces, and pure dynamics with no underlying things at all. He describes a world of relations without relata.
I need an analogy for this, because trying to picture an action without an actor completely breaks your brain.
It's very difficult.
It's like, think of a thunderstorm. When we look at the sky, we say it is flashing. But what is the it? There is no hidden, solid it hiding behind the clouds doing the flashing.
That's a perfect way to think about it.
The flashing is the lightning. The event is the entire reality. There is no doer separate from the deed.
That is a brilliant analogy. Nietzsche thinks all of human psychology, biology, and reality is like that lightning. The will to power isn't some mystical force that a person has and uses to dominate others.
Which is how it's usually interpreted.
Right, but the will to power is just a name for the constant shifting interplay of dynamic forces that constitutes reality. By using a phrase like will to power, he is pushing language past its breaking point to show us that our traditional comforting way of categorizing reality into neat little boxes of subjects and objects is just a useful human habit, not an absolute divine truth.
He is constantly pulling the rug out from under us. Which brings us to perhaps his most famous, most misunderstood, and most emotionally heavy self-consuming concept, the eternal recurrence.
Oh, this is the big one.
In his book, The Gay Science, Nietzsche introduces this idea, But crucially, he doesn't present it as a peer-reviewed physical theory of the cosmos. He doesn't care if the physics actually work out. He presents it as the ultimate psychological, existential thought experiment.
Yes, and the framing he uses is terrifyingly intimate.
How does he frame it?
He writes, imagine that one day or night, a demon creeps into your loneliness, your most vulnerable, isolated moment, and whispers something in your ear.
Okay, spooky.
The demon says that this exact life, exactly as you are living it right now, and exactly as you have lived it in the past, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more.
Forever.
And there will be nothing new in it. Every pain, every joy, every passing thought, every sigh, and every unutterably small or great thing in your life will return to you in the exact same sequence forever, like an hourglass turning over and over infinitely.
I want you, the listener, to just pause whatever you're doing right now and genuinely ask yourself that question. Take it seriously. If a demon told you that your life was on an infinite, uneditable loop, what would your gut reaction be?
It's a heavy thought.
Would you throw yourself to the ground, gnash your teeth, and curse the demon as the most evil entity imaginable? Because you'd have to relive every heartbreak, every humiliating failure, every moment of physical agony, every boring Tuesday morning commute forever.
Most people would probably curse the demon.
Or would you experience a moment of profound, world-shattering revelation? Would you look at the demon and say, you are a god and I have never heard anything more divine?
It is the heaviest weight imaginable. It is the ultimate diagnostic test of what Nietzsche calls amor fati, the love of fate.
Love of fate.
He is asking, are you living a life that you would genuinely, passionately want to repeat for all eternity without a single edit, deletion, or amendation?
Most of us, if we are honest, would want to be the editor of our own lives.
Absolutely. We'd want to keep the joyous moments, but edit out the horrors, the embarrassments, the grief. We want to trim the fat.
But you can't.
No. To affirm the eternal recurrence is to say a radical, uncompromising yes to the entirety of your existence exactly as it is, because the joy and the suffering are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other.
It completely shifts the focus of human existence. For thousands of years, religion has told us to endure this life in the hopes of a better, perfect afterlife. The eternal recurrence destroys the afterlife.
It brings everything back down to earth.
It forces you to justify this exact moment right here, right now. It forces you to construct your own meaning on the ground you are standing on, because he was utterly obsessed with how we construct meaning and pretend we didn't.
He was.
There's this stunning, haunting quote from an early, unpublished essay of his from 1873 called On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. Listen to how he describes what we confidently call facts and truths. He asks, what then is truth?
And how does he answer?
He answers, a movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. Truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of sensuous force. Coins which have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and no longer as coins.
That quote perfectly encapsulates his deconstructive genius. We invent a metaphor to describe a feeling, we use it for centuries, and eventually we forget we invented it.
We treat it as law.
We start treating the metaphor as a solid, undeniable fact of reality. We forget that the coin was minted by human hands. But we have to remember, he didn't just wake up one day and write this. He didn't emerge fully formed with these ideas. It was a long, agonizing, highly combative intellectual evolution.
Let's trace that chronological journey. Let's walk through how a polite prodigy classicist evolved into the man who declared the death of God. His first major publication in 1872 was The Birth of Tragedy.
That book caused quite a stir.
It completely shocked and frankly alienated his older academic colleagues. They expected a dry, footnote-heavy philological analysis of Greek grammar. Instead, he delivered a highly speculative, passionate, almost mystical treatise.
It was wildly unorthodox for a classicist.
He argued that the staggering greatness of ancient Greek culture, specifically their tragic plays, came from the volatile collision of two deeply opposing psychological forces, which he named after the Greek gods Apollo and Dionysus.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of human psychology, his analysis is brilliant and entirely applicable today.
Break down Apollo and Dionysus for us.
So, the Apollonian principle represents order, form, static beauty, clear boundaries, and individuality. Think of sculpture or architecture. It is the rational, structured, sense-making part of our minds.
And Dionysus.
The Dionysian principle, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. It is frenzy, excess, intoxication, music, the collapse of individual boundaries, and the terrifying but thrilling realization that we're fundamentally part of a chaotic, turbulent underlying whole.
Let's bring this into modern life. The Apollonian is the spreadsheet. It's your carefully curated LinkedIn profile, your daily routine, the neat little boxes you put your life into so you don't feel overwhelmed.
Right, it keeps us sane.
But we need more than that. The Dionysian is the massive music festival where the bass is so loud you can't hear yourself think, and you lose your sense of self in the crowd. It's the primal release.
Exactly.
And Nietzsche argues that the Greeks understood that life, at its core, was Dionysian. It was terrifying, chaotic, and individual humans were intensely vulnerable to suffering and death. But they didn't despair.
They found a way to face it.
By sitting in the amphitheater, watching the tragic hero be destroyed on stage, while the chorus chanted music that pulled the audience into a Dionysian frenzy, they achieved a kind of aesthetic salvation. They realized that while the individual form Apollo inevitably dies, the underlying pulse of life Dionysus is indestructible, eternal, and joyous.
They managed to look into the abyss of existence and say yes to it through art. But then, according to Nietzsche, a historical tragedy occurred.
Who ruined it?
Socrates, the philosopher, and Euripides, the playwright, came along and ruined everything. Socrates championed hyper-rationality. He introduced this dangerous idea that reason, logic, and dialectics could essentially fix reality.
The idea that we can think our way out of suffering.
Exactly. He believed that if we just thought hard enough, we could conquer human vulnerability, eliminate suffering, and make the world perfectly comprehensible. He elevated the Apollonian drive for order to an absolute tyrant, and he violently repressed the Dionysian reality of chaos.
He basically killed tragedy.
And Nietzsche argues that this Socratic delusion, this arrogant idea that science, reason, and logic can somehow solve the tragedy of existence, has infected Western culture ever since.
We are still living in that Socratic delusion. We genuinely believe that if we just get a better app or invent a better AI or pass a better law, we can engineer suffering out of the human experience.
It's the modern faith.
Nietzsche carried this ferocious attack on the modern obsession with pure intellect into this next major project, a series of essays called The Unfashionable Observations, published between 1873 and 1876.
Also translated as Untimely Meditations.
Right. He brutally attacked a very famous popular theologian of his day named David Strauss, basically exposing him as a shallow, complacent, cultural Philistine. But for me, the most profound essay from this period is his critique on the danger of history.
Yes, his essay on the use and abuse of history for life. He looked at the modern university system and modern historical scholarship people, hoarding facts for the sake of facts, endlessly categorizing the past, and he said this obsession is psychologically devastating.
It paralyzes us.
It turns us into walking encyclopedias instead of active creators. It makes us feel like we are just a late, insignificant afterthought in the grand, determined sweep of time, leading to a jaded, cynical, paralyzing relativism.
He argued that history is only valuable if it serves life, if it fuels our present action. And he categorized 3 healthy ways to use history, and I want the listener to really think about which one they use.
These are great categories.
First, there is monumental history. This is when we look at the great towering figures of the past, not to worship them, but to inspire ourselves. It shows us that human greatness was once possible, and therefore, it can be possible again.
Right, drawing strength from the past.
Second, there is antiquarian history. This is the careful preservation of our roots, like tracing your family tree or preserving a historic building. It gives us a comforting, grounding sense of identity.
Which is necessary for stability.
And third, there is critical history. This is when we ruthlessly judge, interrogate, and condemn the flaws, injustices, and toxic traditions of the past so we can actively break free from them and breathe new air.
So we aren't trapped by the past.
The challenge he poses to us today is profound. How do you consume history? When you watch a documentary or read a news article, does it empower your life? Does it inspire you?
Right.
Or does it just drown you in trivial, paralyzing trivia that makes you feel powerless?
That's a vital question. And speaking of breaking free, that brings us to 1878 and a massive structural shift in both his life and his writing style with the publication of Human, All Too Human.
What changed?
This marks his break with his early romanticism. He completely abandons traditional long-form essays and starts writing in aphorisms, short, punchy, fragmented paragraphs, sometimes just a single sentence long.
Which is what he's so famous for now.
Now, the reason for this wasn't purely an artistic choice. As we mentioned earlier, His health was failing horribly at this point. He was forced to resign from his professorship at
He
Basel.
was in constant pain, right?
He suffered from blinding, agonizing migraines that would literally incapacitate him with vomiting and pain for days at a time. His eyesight was deteriorating so badly he could barely focus on a page. He physically, biologically couldn't sit at a desk and write a dense 300-page systematic treatise.
So he adapted.
He had to dictate his thoughts while walking in the mountains or jot them down in short, intense, painful bursts during brief periods of physical relief.
It's incredible to think about the physical toll the writing took on him, but this fragmented style actually perfectly suited his anti-systematic philosophy.
It really did.
He didn't want to build a rigid, perfectly logical philosophical cathedral that you could just comfortably walk around inside. He wanted to give the reader sudden, jarring flashes of psychological insight. He wanted to ambush you with a thought.
That's exactly how it feels to read him.
And we see this razor-sharp, aphoristic psychological scalpel at work most vividly in his 1881 book Daybreak, where he begins his sustained, deeply uncomfortable takedown of Christian morality.
This is where he gets incredibly ad hominem, in the best philosophical sense. He stops engaging with the theology.
He doesn't care if it's true.
Right. He stops asking, is the Christian doctrine of salvation objectively true? Instead, he starts asking a much more dangerous psychological question. What kind of psychological condition, what level of internal sickness makes a person want to believe this? What is the hidden payoff?
And his diagnosis is absolutely brutal.
He argues that Christians have been systematically convinced of their own absolute, irredeemable sinfulness and are terrified of an imaginary eternal hell. To cope with this unbearable, crushing sense of inadequacy and fear, they desperately seek a feeling of power.
But they can't get real power.
No, because they are inherently weak, because they cannot exert physical or creative power over the world, they seek power in a much more insidious way, by judging others.
I have to push back a little here because Christianity is fundamentally known as the religion of charity and love. How can he argue it's based on a desire for power?
It's a brilliant, if scathing, insight into the shadow side of human behavior. He argues that this moral framework encourages people to constantly scour the behavior of their neighbors, secretly hoping to find them sinful, lustful, or greedy, just to gain a comparative fleeting sense of spiritual superiority.
So it's about looking down on someone else to feel better.
It is fundamentally uncharitable at its core, yet it brilliantly masquerades as the ultimate morality of love and pity. He says it breeds deep dishonesty, paranoia, and a fundamental hatred for the natural, earthly, physical world, all in favor of a deferred, invisible afterlife.
Wow.
You don't help your neighbor because you love them. You help them to prove to yourself that you are saved and that you are better than the sinner who walked past them.
That is a deeply uncomfortable mirror to look into. And this psychological dismantling sets the perfect explosive stage for 1882, the publication of The Gay Science, and the introduction of the single most famous phrase associated with his name. God is dead.
The big one.
Now, this phrase is so constantly, totally misunderstood. People treat it like a triumphant, edgy atheist bragging about finally defeating religion with science. It is not a celebration. It is not a brag.
Not even slightly. It is a profound warning. If we look closely at the text, specifically the famous aphorism containing the parable of the madman, we see the true, terrifying gravity of the statement.
Set the scene for us.
Nietzsche writes about a madman who runs into the town marketplace at high noon with a lit lantern, shouting frantically, "I seek God! We have killed him, you and I! All of us are his murderers!"
But who is he shouting at?
Now, the crucial detail is who he is talking to. The people gathered in the marketplace are not devout priests. They are modern, scientific atheists. They don't believe in God anymore, and they just laugh at the madman mockingly. They think he's crazy and out of touch.
But the madman realizes something horrifying, that the smug, self-satisfied atheists do not comprehend at all.
They're completely blind to it.
By casually abandoning the Christian God, they haven't just freed themselves from a boring Sunday ritual. They have wiped away the entire foundational architecture of Western meaning, morality, and objective truth.
It's a catastrophic collapse.
The madman asks these devastating questions. What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Away from all suns, are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing?
That image of plunging in all directions, it's vertigo.
The atheists in the marketplace think they can just reject God, but still keep their Christian morals, their belief in human equality, human rights, compassion, and their scientific faith in objective, absolute truth.
And Nietzsche says they can't.
Nietzsche is saying, no, you can't have the shadow without the object casting it. You pulled the ultimate linchpin, and the whole universe of meaning is collapsing into a terrifying nihilism, and you are so superficial you don't even realize you're falling yet.
It is a terrifying, unparalleled diagnosis of the modern condition. The loss of a transcendent guarantor of meaning, a God who says this is good and this is true, leaves humanity totally unmoored, staring blindly into an abyss of our own making.
It's heavy.
And this period of profound philosophical realization coincided with intense, painful personal losses for Nietzsche, most notably his highly traumatic break with the composer Richard Wagner.
Oh, the Wagner fallout. This is such a fascinating psychological study in itself.
It really shaped him.
Early on in his Basel days, Nietzsche absolutely worshipped Wagner. He thought Wagner's sweeping, mythic operas were the modern rebirth of that Dionysian power we talked about. They were incredibly close friends. Nietzsche literally ran Christmas errands for the Wagner family.
He was like an eager apprentice.
He was completely in Wagner's orbit. But Wagner was incredibly arrogant, deeply vain, increasingly nationalistic, and he essentially treated the younger, brilliant philosopher like a glorified lackey and a PR man.
The ego on Wagner was massive.
The final straw came when Wagner wrote his final opera, Parsifal, which Nietzsche viewed as hypocritically religious, pandering to Christian asceticism, and musically decadent. The friendship shattered completely.
He had to cut ties to survive intellectually.
It forces you to wonder how much of our own intellectual independence is shaped by the painful, necessary process of outgrowing our heroes.
That necessity of outgrowing one's teachers, of breaking the idol of the mentor, is a central theme in the book where Nietzsche attempts to answer the immense crisis of the dead God. He realizes he needs to offer a new path forward, a new way to create meaning.
Right.
And he does this in his masterpiece, his most famous and strangest philosophical novel, Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Zarathustra is a wild, strange ride. It's written in this elevated, almost biblical tone. It's a parody of the New Testament and Platonic dialogues.
The style is very jarring if you aren't expecting it.
And the choice of the main character is incredibly deliberate. Zarathustra was the ancient Persian prophet who founded Zoroastrianism. Now, why would Nietzsche, the ultimate anti-religious thinker, choose a religious prophet as his mouthpiece?
It seems counterintuitive.
He chose him because the historical Zarathustra was essentially the very first person in human history to divide the universe into absolute cosmic moral categories of good and evil, light and dark.
He invented the binary.
Therefore, Nietzsche reasons, Zarathustra created the foundational error of morality. He started the disease. So he must be the one to return to Earth, recognize his catastrophic mistake, and teach humanity how to move beyond good and evil.
The structure of the book is organized around the speeches and journeys of this returning enlightened prophet. Zarathustra comes down from his mountain cave, where he has been hoarding his wisdom, to teach humanity about a new goal, the Übermensch, which translates to the superhuman or the overman.
We really need to clarify this term.
Now, we must explicitly state, the Übermensch is not a biological master race. That was the sickening, literalist, fascist distortion. It is purely an existential, spiritual ideal.
What does it look like in practice?
The Übermensch is the individual who is continually experimental, who is capable of overcoming their own prejudices. It is someone who creates their own robust, life-affirming values out of the void left by the dead God, and who remains faithfully, passionately committed to the earth and the physical body, rather than dreaming of imaginary afterlives.
And Zarathustra contrasts the soaring ideal of the Übermensch with the ultimate object of his disgust, which he calls the last man. And this is where it hits uncomfortably close to home today.
Oh, it's a brutal mirror.
The last man is the modern, bourgeois, highly civilized individual whose only goal in life is comfort, security, avoiding risk, and a mild, painless, heavily medicated happiness.
Sounds familiar.
The last man has no desire to strive for greatness, to suffer for a massive creative goal, or to reach for the stars. They just consume entertainment, blink sleepily, and say, "We have invented happiness." It's devastating.
I look at The Last Man, and I see us sitting on our couches, doom-scrolling social media, ordering food delivery, entirely insulated from danger, but entirely disconnected from greatness. It's a chillingly accurate critique of 21st century consumer society.
It absolutely is. And following the poetic, prophetic style of Zarathustra, Nietzsche realizes he needs to be more direct. He drops the fiction and moves into straight, blistering analytical critique with Beyond Good and Evil in 1886. And then he produces his absolute masterpiece of psychological analysis, Toward the Genealogy of Morals, in 1887.
In genealogy, he doesn't just critique our values. He systematically, forensically rips apart their historical origins across 3 devastating essays.
Break down this genealogy for us, because this is where Nietzsche operates like a ruthless forensic detective of the human soul. I want to spend real time here, because this book changes how you view every human interaction.
Gladly. Let's look at the first essay. He asks a fundamental question. Where did the moral concepts of good and evil actually come from historically?
They weren't just always there. He argues they weren't handed down from heaven on stone tablets. Originally, in ancient aristocratic warrior societies, think of the Homeric Greeks or the early Romans, the concept of good simply meant powerful, noble, healthy, wealthy, and masterful.
It was descriptive, not moral.
The strong, vital aristocracy defined themselves, their strength, and their actions as good. By default, the weak, poor, sickly, and conquered people were just considered bad, not evil, just unfortunate, pitiable, and lowly. It was a hierarchy of power, not a judgment of the soul.
Okay, but the weak obviously didn't enjoy being at the bottom of the hierarchy, being crushed by the strong.
Exactly. The weak experienced a profound, simmering, toxic hatred and envy toward the masters. They felt an impotence that curdled into a psychological condition Nietzsche calls resentment, deep, festering resentment.
And what did they do with that resentment?
Because the slaves lacked the physical or political power to overthrow the masters in reality, they enacted a brilliant, subversive spiritual revenge. They completely flipped the moral script.
A total inversion.
They declared that the natural traits of the master's power, wealth, ambition, pride, physical dominance were actually morally evil. And they declared that their own involuntary, unavoidable traits, weakness, poverty, forced submission, turning the other cheek because you can't fight back, were actually chosen, elevated virtues, which they proudly called good.
So they made their weakness look like a choice.
Thus, slave morality was born. It is a morality not of creation, but of reaction and resentment.
That is such a devastating psychological flip. Let me make sure I had this right. He's saying that when people perform intense moral outrage, when they tear down successful, powerful, or beautiful people under the guise of justice or humility, they aren't actually being purely moral.
That's his argument.
They're just acting out this ancient slave morality resentment. They are weaponizing morality to drag the strong down to their level because they can't elevate themselves. That is a brutal assessment of human nature.
It is brutal.
And then, in the second essay, he tackles something even closer to our daily lives: bad conscience, or guilt. Where does the feeling of guilt come from?
Nietzsche argues that human beings, like all animals, have a natural biological disposition toward cruelty, aggression, and exerting power over the world.
We are animals after all.
But when we formed civil societies and cities, we were forced by laws, punishments, and social norms to suppress our outward instincts for cruelty. We couldn't just attack our neighbors anymore without consequence.
Civilization requires that suppression.
But that aggressive predatory drive didn't just disappear. Energy has to go somewhere. Deprived of external enemies, it turned inward. We began to torture ourselves.
The internalization of instinct. We actually created the concept of the internal soul as a private theater where we could punish ourselves without breaking the law.
Exactly.
So guilt is simply our own blocked cruelty, redirecting itself against our own psyches. We become the torturer and the tortured.
Yes, and he argues this internalization reaches its agonizing genius peak in the Christian concept of the crucifixion. You have a God who sacrifices himself for the sins of the very people who killed him.
It creates an unpayable debt.
This creates a debt so massive, so infinite, that humanity can never ever repay it. It maximizes the internal torture of guilt for all eternity.
Which leads perfectly into the third essay. Ascetic ideals. Why do human beings globally, across various cultures, revere people who actively deny themselves pleasure? Fasting, chastity, self-flagellation, poverty. Why is punishing the body seen as holy?
What's his answer?
Nietzsche says it's a will to nothingness. The ascetic priest, the religious leader, is basically acting as a doctor, treating a deeply sick, suffering congregation.
Sick from what?
The congregation is suffering from the inherent misery of life and this agonizing, internalized guilt we just talked about. The priest gives them a remedy. He tells them they are suffering because they are inherently sinful.
The priest provides an immediate, intoxicating rush of meaning. The suffering is no longer random, chaotic, or meaningless. It is now a justified punishment for sin.
The priest's remedy makes the sick feel temporarily better by giving them a clear target for their pain themselves. It provides emotional catharsis.
But it's a trap.
But, Nietzsche warns, this cure is ultimately worse than the disease. It is a slow poison. By teaching people to hate their instincts, to hate their bodies, and to long for an afterlife, the ascetic priest deadens the will to live in the real, physical world. It makes humanity sicker over the long run.
It's incredibly heavy, dense, and dark stuff. But I think it's also really important to note that Nietzsche wasn't just this gloomy, brooding prophet of doom.
He actually had a great sense of humor.
There is immense, almost laugh-out-loud humor in his work if you know how to read it, especially in Part 4 of Zarathustra. That section was essentially a private joke that he only printed a few copies of to share with close friends.
Basically a satire of his own fans.
In it, Zarathustra encounters these higher men who have heard his teachings, but they take all his metaphors way too literally and end up looking completely ridiculous. They even hold a parodic, blasphemous version of the Last Supper where they literally worship a braying donkey.
Nietzsche's basically mocking his own readers. He's mocking the danger of his own philosophy becoming a rigid cult.
That intense self-awareness is key to understanding him. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, every great philosophy, whether it admits it or not, is just an involuntary and unconscious memoir of the philosopher who wrote it.
It's a confession of their deepest psychological needs.
He knew his own ideas, his own attacks on Christianity were deeply tied to his own psychology, his own loneliness, and his own physical suffering.
So what does this all mean for us today? When we passionately, aggressively argue our own political or moral beliefs on social media, or we get into a heated debate at a dinner party, what are we actually confessing?
That's a great question to throw to the listener.
Are we really fighting for objective, universal truth, or are we just writing our own involuntary memoirs in public? Are we just displaying our own hidden resentments and psychological needs? It forces an immense amount of self-reflection.
It does. And in the spirit of self-reflection, we must address the persistent controversies that come with his memoirs. Nietzsche is routinely, fiercely accused of elitism and sexism.
We can't gloss over this.
Now, the elitism is undeniable and explicit. He openly despised democracy, socialism, and egalitarianism, believing society should essentially exist solely as a scaffolding to produce a few towering, creative geniuses. The sexism, however, is much more complex and contradictory.
Right. There was that incredibly infamous quote from Zarathustra, "You are going to women. Do not forget the whip."
Yeah, people read that one line out of context and immediately brand him a cartoonish, irredeemable misogynist.
But the context of the text matters entirely. Zarathustra doesn't just say that as a command. Zarathustra is giving a speech romanticizing women, and an old woman interrupts him.
Oh, an old woman says it.
The old woman is the one who gives Zarathustra the advice about the whip, basically mocking his naive, idealized, overly romantic male view of gender dynamics. It's a joke at Zarathustra's expense.
Exactly. And his actual biography reflects this complexity. He was raised in a household entirely composed of strict, pious women after his father died. As an adult, his marriage proposals were rejected.
He had a complicated relationship with women.
Yet the women he most admired, respected, and associated with, like the brilliant psychoanalyst Lou Andrea Salome, who completely intellectually matched him, and Cosima Wagner, were fiercely independent, intellectually formidable, dominant women who aggressively defied the gender norms of the 19th century.
His textual remarks on women are often contradictory puzzles, sometimes reflecting his own bitter romantic failures rather than coherent, systematic political platforms.
And all of this intense psychological analysis, this rapid-fire publication, all of these contradictory thoughts were building toward an incredible crescendo. All of his frantic, lonely output led to one final, absolutely explosive year of lucidity before the darkness of his illness fell forever.
The year was 1888.
It is arguably one of the most staggering, incomprehensible years of productivity in literary history. Operating in a state of manic, almost euphoric energy, battling constant physical pain, Nietzsche wrote 5 entire world-changing books in a single year.
Let's run through them, because the titles alone are amazing. He starts with The Case of Wagner, definitively declaring his former idol, and by extension all of modern culture, to be utterly decadent and sick.
Then what?
Then he writes Twilight of the Idols, which has the fantastic, famous subtitle, How to Philosophize with a Hammer.
I'm so glad you brought up a subtitle, because the hammer metaphor is constantly, universally misunderstood. People picture a brute swinging a massive sledgehammer, blindly smashing the beautiful marble statues of the past into dust.
Like destroying everything.
But Nietzsche himself clarifies in the text that the hammer is actually a tuning fork. It's a delicate instrument used by a philosophical diagnostician.
He's tapping, not smashing.
He is taking this tuning fork and gently but firmly tapping the great, revered, unquestioned idols of Western culture, our moral absolutes, our religious truths, our faith in science. And when he taps them, he isn't breaking them. He is listening.
What does he hear?
He hears the hollow sound of bloated, rotting entrails inside. He's exposing their internal emptiness, their hidden decay, not just blindly destroying them.
That completely changes how you read him. I've been picturing a sledgehammer my whole life. He's listening for the rot. And he hears the most profound rot when he turns his tuning fork toward the institutional church in his next, most vitriolic book, The Antichrist.
Right.
Now, you hear a title like The Antichrist, and you immediately think he just hated Jesus of Nazareth with a burning passion. But the source material highlights a crucial, fascinating distinction that most people miss. He actually deeply admired Jesus.
He did. It's a stunning pivot. He called Jesus a free spirit and described him as being blissed out.
Blissed out. I love that.
Nietzsche believed that the actual historical Jesus didn't care about rigid dogmas or building vast institutions or waiting for a magical afterlife. He believed Jesus taught that the kingdom of God was an internal psychological state of the heart, a way of living right now in the present moment in a state of love and non-resistance to reality.
So who's the real target?
The real villain of the Antichrist, the actual target of his hatred, isn't Jesus, it's the Apostle Paul.
He calls Paul genius in hatred. Nietzsche argued that Paul took the peaceful, internal, present-focused message of Jesus and completely corrupted it.
Paul militarized it.
Paul transformed it into a massive, institutionalized power structure built entirely on the concept of eternal guilt, original sin, and the delayed gratification of heaven. Paul turned a beautiful state of the heart into a psychological weapon of mass control.
He essentially accuses Paul of inventing Christianity as we know it, destroying the message of Christ in the process.
Following that blistering, earth-scorching attack on religion, Nietzsche turns his gaze entirely inward. On his 44th birthday, he begins writing Ecce Homo, his profoundly bizarre, deeply moving autobiography.
Bizarre is almost an understatement. Look at the chapter titles. Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books, and Why I Am a Destiny.
Such ego.
People read those titles when the book was finally published and immediately concluded, well, the syphilis had clearly eaten his brain by this point. He was a total megalomaniac. He was totally insane here.
But again, that's a superficial misreading of his stylistic intent. It is a deliberate, highly comic parody of Socratic modesty.
How so?
Socrates famously claimed he was the wisest man in Athens, precisely because he knew nothing. Nietzsche flips that script entirely, claiming ultimate world historic wisdom. But then, in a brilliant move, he grounds that supposed divine wisdom in the most incredibly mundane physical things.
Like what?
In Ecce Homo, he ignores abstract metaphysical debates entirely. Instead, he talks extensively about his diet, nutrition, the climate of the cities he lives in, the importance of good digestion, and what kind of tea he drinks.
He's saying that taking care of your physical body, paying close attention to what you eat, how you exercise, and where you live is vastly more important to actual human flourishing than endlessly debating whether the soul is immortal or what the precise definition of truth is.
Getting back to the body.
He's grounding philosophy back in the dirt, the blood, and the literal guts of human physiology.
This raises an important question, one that resonates deeply in our contemporary society. Nietzsche argues that all of our grand politics, our social organizations, our complex education systems are fundamentally falsified because we systematically despise these little things of the body and instead obsess over abstract, overarching ideological dogmas.
It's so relevant today.
How much of our modern political gridlock, our societal anxiety, and our physical misery is still driven by this exact phenomenon? We debate abstract political ideologies online for hours while completely ignoring the tangible physical well-being, the nutrition, and the actual environments of real human beings. We are still alienated from our bodies.
He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew the explosive impact his ideas would eventually have on the world. In Ecce Homo, he writes the chillingly prophetic line, "I am no man, I am dynamite."
And he was.
A few months later, in January 1889, the dynamite detonated. He collapsed in the streets of Turin, Italy. The famous, perhaps apocryphal story is that he saw a horse being brutally beaten by a cab driver, and he ran over, threw his arms around the horse's neck, weeping, and collapsed. He never recovered his sanity.
He spent the next 11 years of his life in a vegetative state, cared for first by his mother and then by his sister, entirely unaware of the world-altering monumental fame that was beginning to gather around his name, or the dark ways his sister was twisting his legacy.
It is an incredible, monumental, and ultimately tragic arc. We've journeyed today from that cramped, simple, freezing room in Sils Maria and the tragic, deeply unromantic medical reality of his illness.
We covered a lot of ground.
We've traced his path through the therapeutic renaming of truth, his chilling diagnosis of the death of God and the collapse of meaning, his forensic surgical vivisection of our moral guilt, and finally to the explosive, delicate tuning fork taps of 1888.
And through all the contradictions, all the shifting perspectives, and all the provocation, what remains constant in his work is his unrelenting demand for absolute intellectual honesty.
No blind followers.
He didn't want blind disciples. He loathed the idea of followers memorizing his quotes. He wanted to inspire free spirits, individuals capable of ruthlessly examining their own involuntary memoirs, questioning the hollow, rotting idols of their specific age, and ultimately embracing amor fati, having the courage to love their exact, unedited, painful, and beautiful lives.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you, our listener, with one final, lingering, highly provocative challenge to mull over as you go about your day. It's a concept drawn from a brilliant essay by Jörg Salacorda in our source material, and it is perhaps Nietzsche's most unsettling, penetrating insight for our current 21st century era.
In his later years, Nietzsche became increasingly furious and disappointed as he looked at the modern, enlightened people around him. He observed the secular liberals, the early socialists, the progressives, the champions of various emancipatory movements, people who proudly and loudly believed they had bravely thrown off the dark shackles of religious superstition and were rapidly moving humanity forward into a bright, rational, scientific utopia.
But Nietzsche, utilizing his incredibly sharp genealogical critique, saw right through their self-congratulations.
He suggested that they hadn't escaped Christianity at all. He argued that these modern, secular, heavily egalitarian ideologies, the intense desire to level all hierarchies, the modern cultural focus on victimhood as a status symbol, the automatic moral elevation of the downtrodden simply because they are downtrodden, are actually the exact same Christian morality of resentment and pity for the weak.
They just repackaged the moral system and quietly removed the God from the top of it.
They kept the exact same psychological architecture of slave morality. They kept the deep-seated suspicion of the strong, the successful, and the exceptionally talented. But they dressed it up in the modern, acceptable language of secular justice, equity, and political progress.
It's the same guilt.
Nietzsche saw that they were still driven by the exact same ascetic ideals, the exact same internalized guilt, just channeled into social reform and political activism instead of prayers for religious salvation.
And that is the final thought we leave you with today. Look closely at your own deepest, most modern, seemingly secular values. Look at the things you consider self-evidently good, just, and progressive in our society right now.
Ask yourself the hard questions.
Are they truly independent, life-affirming, free-spirited creations? Have you genuinely moved beyond good and evil? Or are your deepest values just the lingering shadow of a dead god still echoing loudly in the cave of the 21st century? We want to warmly thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions. Keep tapping your tuning forks against the idols of our age. And until next time, take care.